Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS. I'm so happy that you've joined us for the last session in our fall series on friendship. The series, as you know, is called Two Are Better Than One, Friendship in Jewish Text, Thought, and Life. And it's been such an interesting experience to learn about this theme from so many different perspectives and scholars from so many different fields. If you're joining us for the first time today, we're very happy to have you as well. And you should feel free to check out the other sessions in the series page that you received in your email. You may hear that I am not sounding like my normal self today. If you have ever heard me before, I've had a terrible case of COVID. I'm actually doing so much better today than I have been for the last several days, but I haven't done anything like this. So I'm going to get through as much as I can. And if I need to bow out early, then other wonderful folks on our community engagement team will definitely be here to pinch hit for me. We're so pleased to have Dr. Shira Billet teaching us today. She is Assistant Professor of Jewish Thought and Ethics at JTS, and she actually really inspired this series. She and her colleague, Emeritus Professor Dr. Alan Middleman, put together last year a symposium on this theme of civic friendship, which she can tell you more about. But it inspired a public lecture and teaching that she actually did at Camp Nyack over the summer, and various other programs that really kind of got a lot of us thinking about this theme. And that's what led us to choose this theme for the fall. So she is going to tie it all up for us. We broadened the theme to think about friendship more generally, but civic friendship, the theme that inspired it, is where she's going to bring us to today. And again, I will let her define that term for you and tell all of us why it's important. And she is also tying the session into Hanukkah. So the title of her session today is Civic Friendship in Times of Crisis and War, Jewish Thought, Political Theory, and the Story of Hanukkah. So I cannot wait to learn with you, Dr. Billet. We also want to make sure, since this is the last session of our fall series, to tell you about our spring series. So we are going to take a winter break like everyone else, and then we're going to be starting a new series on Monday, January 22nd. And we decided to try something new this spring. Instead of doing one specific theme, we have invited our faculty to teach on what they are most excited to teach. So they're going to be teaching on what feels, on their current research, on what feels most pressing to them, on their greatest passions. So we're going to have a really, really diverse set of topics, like some really wonderful sessions. I'm very excited about the series. And we also invited the faculty, since since our hearts and minds are so focused on Israel, during this time, we've invited our faculty, if they felt so inspired, to teach Israel-related sessions. So several of them will be doing that as well. So you can watch your email in the coming weeks for more information and registration, but we will have a really wonderful series for you this spring, starting again on Monday, January 22nd. I will turn it over to Tani now for some announcements and to introduce Dr. Billet more formally.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review the format for our session, as we usually do, Dr. Billet will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Billet. Since we received a large number of questions, we would appreciate it if you could express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Bettinger. The sources for today's class, the link is up on the webpage now. We'll be screen sharing them as well. And pleased to introduce Dr. Shira Billet, Assistant Professor of Jewish Thought and Ethics at JTS and Academic Director of JTS's Hendel Center for Ethics and Justice. And you can learn more about Dr. Billet on the bio with the sources as well. And as Rabbi Andelman mentioned, Dr. Billet has been, it was really the inspiration for this our fall series in terms of the work that she's been doing on friendship and civic friendship. And she, in the past year, she has coordinated 2 events at JTS on the topic of civic friendship, and I'm going to put information in the chat, and as well as an interview that she recently did, and I'm going to put that in as well. And I'm so pleased to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Billet.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be speaking with all of you today. In this final lecture in the JTS Fall Learning Series on Friendship in Jewish Text, Thought, and Life, we're turning, as you've heard, to a concept from political thought, from political theory, called civic friendship. And we'll say more about this looking at some sources in a moment, but I just want to say a few things generally. Civic friendship is the idea that we need to import aspects of friendship from the private sphere, friendship that we all know of people that we choose to be in relationships of friendship with. So we need to import some aspects of that into the public and political sphere. We need to pursue a kind of friendship with our fellow citizens, people we don't know, but that we share a country with, a nation with, a political project with. We need to pursue a kind of friendship with them as part of the building block of a flourishing society. There can't really be politics, at least not any kind of good politics, without friendship, without some kind of friendship. And again, we'll talk a little bit about what that is. In our own hyperpolarized American society, we ourselves have all witnessed how absent the trappings of friendship have become between citizens with different political views. Civic enmity, the opposite of civic friendship, the hatred of our fellow citizens, has become more of a hallmark of American civic life and the American public square in recent years. In many ways, this topic could not be more urgent. Without trust, which is a key component not only of private friendship, right? Friendship among the people that we choose to be in that kind of relationship with. It's also a key component of civic friendship. And without trust, it's impossible to work collaboratively to address the challenges that affect all of us. So since last year, as you've heard, I've been part of several JTS initiatives relating to civic friendship and American society, and especially thinking about what Jewish thought has to offer to broader conversations in political thought about this topic. But at the same time, since I was asked to teach on civic friendship for this series, our collective attention has turned toward Israel and Gaza, to the war, and also today is the 4th day of Hanukkah. And while without the context of the war in Israel and today being Hanukkah, I might have chosen to talk about different sources for my talk today. There's really so much material within the history of Jewish thought and Jewish texts that we can draw upon for thinking about civic friendship. And the story of Hanukkah provides plenty of such material, which I will draw upon today. And it's beneficial not only because it's relevant to the holiday that we're currently celebrating, but also very much to wartime, because Hanukkah is a holiday about the aftermath of a war and what happened in that time. And so we're going to be thinking about that a lot. The material that we'll be looking at today highlights the aspiration to overcome civic enmity and to achieve civic friendship as a hope that we can have even within war times, something that we can imagine a better future for, even in a time when there is so much destruction. The material I present also shows the ways that friendship and civic friendship can be sources of hope and joy in times of crisis more broadly, not just in times of war. And I just want to mention 2 caveats before I really dive into the sources that I want to share with you today. The first is that the topic of civic friendship generally refers to a kind of friendship between citizens of the same polis, that is, of the same state or country. But we can also begin to think about how the notion of civic friendship, which is a kind of friendship between strangers who nevertheless are part of some collective that is shared and some project that is shared. So we can begin to think about how this concept, which is really about the citizens within the same country who are strangers to one another, how it can help us transform relationships more broadly beyond the borders of an individual nation, towards people who are not civic enemies, that is our fellow citizens who, for whatever reason, we feel a hatred towards or an inability to be in community towards. Again, something that we've seen a lot in America, especially over the past couple of years, but also across borders, and to people who are viewed as more traditional kinds of enemies. So while I'm not really going to address that topic, certainly in the discussion, I would be happy to talk about ways we might think about civic friendship as useful beyond, as a useful concept beyond just one country, but towards thinking about more human collaboration across political borders. And my second caveat is just to say that friendship is hard work. That's true of the friends that we love and choose and have shared experiences with. And I'm sure everyone on this Zoom has experienced that friendships don't just succeed on inertia. Some friendships often face really difficult challenges, and work needs to be done to maintain them. And so even more so, we can imagine how much work it takes to build trust between strangers in a political community, and especially when there are histories that are complicated, story where one side had maybe did something and a different side feels mistrust that resulted from that. How do we overcome these things? And again, thinking about America today as an example, what would it take to really build trust between Democrats and Republicans, between different citizens from different religious traditions and worldviews? And when we think about how much individual friendship is hard work to maintain, we can only just imagine what incredible work it is to create civic friendship within a country. And so I just want to share that I'm going to present sources, and I'm going to try to give a message of hope, which I really deeply believe in. But I also just want to add that none of this should take away from just our awareness of how hard the work is. Okay, and so with that, I would like to turn to the source sheets, which will be shared. And our first set of sources are just a few quotations about the concept of civic friendship. So we're going to fly through these sources and then turn to the Jewish material that I want to present today with these sources in mind. So the concept of civic friendship is often attributed to Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher, scientist, really just a kind of scholar in every field that scholarship could be achieved in his lifetime. He lived in the 4th century in Athens, in the 4th century before the Common Era in Athens, and he is considered a founding figure of political philosophy. And he spent some time writing about a concept of civic friendship. And in the quote that I have here in source number 1, Aristotle says, "It is thought to be the special business of the political art to produce friendship." Aristotle, in his books on politics, which were named, which had the word ethics in their title, Aristotle believed that ethics and politics are just intertwined with one another. You can't have ethics, which is good ways of treating fellow citizens interpersonally and good ways of acting in our relationships with other people. You can't have that outside of the context of a really flourishing political society where such relationships are fostered. And so Aristotle actually believed that politics, that politics was the place where one should talk about the topic of friendship. This might seem counterintuitive again, because we typically think of friendship as something in the private sphere, something that's outside of politics. But I think that number one, we've seen, especially again in the past couple of years, the way that politics has entered into friendships in this country and beyond, and it's become harder to maintain private friendships across political commitments. So number one, that should give us a clue to the idea that friendship and politics are less separate from one another than one might think. But also that Aristotle really thinks that friendship, even the ordinary kind of friendship, is something that needs to happen inside a flourishing society. And that on the flip side, in addition to that ordinary friendship of, confidants and people who we have shared experiences with and who we love and trust and who console us. I hope you can all hear me and see me. I just got a note that my microphone wasn't working for a moment.
We lost you for a second.
Okay, so I'm not really sure what was the last thing.
Just like the last sentence, that's all.
Okay, so I'll just mention. Okay, Aristotle strongly believed
Dr.
that.
Bill, you can't. Are you able to turn your camera back on, or? Oh, there we go.
Sorry for the tech issues. Hopefully this will keep working. So Aristotle believed that friendship, the friendship among confidants, people who console one another, who love one another, that is also the work of politics in a certain kind of way. And then on the flip side, that part of the work of politics is to produce friendship also between strangers. But what would that friendship look like? And this is something that Aristotle talked about and other ancient political theorists did, and also political thinkers in the modern period have also discussed. So I bring you two passages from a 20th century political thinker, a Jewish political thinker, Hannah Arendt. And also I bring you a quotation from a 20th and 21st century, so really a very contemporary, we should really say 21st century, political thinker Danielle Allen, who also talks about this topic extensively. So in source number 2, we have Hannah Arendt saying that there's an analogy between love and friendship in the private sphere and friendship in the public sphere. She says, what love is in its own narrowly circumscribed sphere, respect is in the larger domain of human affairs. Respect is a kind of friendship, but without intimacy and without closeness. So Hannah Arendt says that there's a kind of analogy between the love that we feel for our friends and that we express towards our friends, and a different emotion that we express and feel towards fellow citizens in the public square. And that different emotion is respect. Not to say that we don't also respect our friends, but hopefully the love that we feel for our friends also includes respect. But respect is a kind of love without actually feeling love. It's a way you treat someone you love, but you don't need to love them in order to treat people with respect and to feel respect. And so that's helping us get at what civic friendship might begin to look like. Again, what is friendship between strangers? It's respect, which is a kind of more public version of love. It's a more generic version of love, and it doesn't require intimacy or closeness. And then Danielle Allen takes this a bit further and says, and this is source number 3, again, a contemporary political philosopher, it is not the emotions of friendship that are relevant to politics, but rather its core practices. And so Allen says, we don't need to feel emotions at all towards our fellow citizens. That is the emotions of friendship, whatever they may be. But what we do need is to act towards our fellow citizens in certain key ways that we act towards our friends. And that means basic things like not betraying people, treating people with dignity, thinking about not only our own good, but their good as well, especially when those two come in conflict. Okay, so certain core practices of friendship we can import into politics without the emotions of friendship. Okay, so that's just a little bit of an introduction to the concept of civic friendship. from Aristotle, who's kind of considered to be the originator of the concept in many ways, and then to one contemporary and one recent political philosopher who both found this topic to be very important in their political thought. And then the last source that I wanted to mention as part of my introduction is from Maimonides, Moses ben Maimon, the Rambam, 13th century Jewish political philosopher, halachic scholar, philosopher not just of politics, but of metaphysics, kind of similar to Aristotle, just was a kind of expert in many different areas of thought in his time. And he lived in the 12th century and spent most of his career in North Africa and Egypt. And Maimonides, in writing his famous book of philosophy, of Jewish philosophy, The Guide of the Perplexed, one of the chapters talks about the Jewish holidays. And part of what Maimonides is doing in these chapters is he's actually talking about the entire system of Jewish law. And he's trying to show how each part of Jewish law serves an important purpose. Part of this is that he's trying to show how Jewish law is a rational system that is so well organized and well cultivated, with paying attention to so many different aspects of human flourishing, that it could only be a system of law that was given by a perfect God. That's part of Maimonides' goal in these sections, is to kind of justify the law as God. But for our purposes, I just wanted to show what he says in general as part of his introduction to his discussion of specifically the laws relating to the Jewish holidays. So Maimonides writes, "The festivals are all for rejoicing and pleasurable gatherings, which in most cases are indispensable for human beings. They are also useful in the establishment of friendship, which must exist among people in political societies." So Maimonides saw that one of the primary purposes of holidays in the Jewish legal system was to foster civic friendship, was to bring people together in ways that created joy and communal togetherness, and that would establish friendship. And he explicitly connects this to politics more broadly, because he says that friendship must exist amongst people in political societies. And of course, it's no coincidence that Maimonides would refer to this topic, of course, because Maimonides was very well versed in the philosophy of Aristotle. And so he would have been aware of Aristotle's discussions of civic friendship. And Maimonides thought that Aristotle's ideas about civic friendship were very relevant to how we might think about certain aspects of Jewish law, not just the holidays, which Maimonides saw as fostering exactly that, as bringing citizens together who were different from one another, who were strangers to one another, to create friendship through shared experiences, through shared festivities, through rejoicing together. And this would create a stronger society. So the reason I thought it was useful to bring this particular source today is because we're going to look at some sources about how the holiday of Hanukkah was established. It's not a holiday that was mandated in the Bible, so it's not one of the holidays that Maimonides talks about when he's talking about biblical law. But nevertheless, some of the ideas that Maimonides talks about, the ways that holidays foster civic friendship, will be relevant also to the establishment of this new holiday of Hanukkah, that again was established at a particular later historical moment during the Second Temple period. So now we're going to turn to the next set of sources. Now that we have in mind just the general introduction to the concept of civic friendship, I wanted to turn to Jewish sources. And primarily, we're going to be looking at sources relating to Hanukkah. But I wanted to first mention a general introduction to the Jewish sources before we turn to Hanukkah. And so the first source that I just wanted to mention has to do with the kind of method with which I am bringing together Jewish texts, primarily ancient Jewish texts, with political philosophy, and basically showing you, which is what I will be doing today, showing you how certain concepts from political philosophy are found in Jewish texts, or are even deepened or enhanced in certain ways in Jewish texts. But it's important to mention that these Jewish texts, none of them present themselves as political philosophy, or even as philosophy at all, except for the source from Maimonides that I just cited. But the other Jewish sources we'll be looking at are not sources that present themselves as philosophical texts, and they don't present themselves as doing philosophy. Nevertheless, they contain a lot of material that is very relevant to thinking philosophically, especially in terms of our topic today, to thinking about political philosophy. So as part of introducing my own method for bringing together these two traditions towards doing a little bit of kind of Jewish political philosophy, I present to you in source number 5, a quotation from Emmanuel Levinas, a 20th century French Jewish philosopher who primarily wrote works of philosophy and ethics that included Jewish material in different ways, but were not particularly Jewish in the sense that they were seen as works of ethics more broadly, that were influential to a lot of different groups of people in a lot of different traditions. But Levinas also taught and then wrote up, or students wrote up, lectures on the Talmud, where he did a kind of philosophical reading of the Talmud. And there's an English translation of some of these lectures called 9 Talmudic Readings, which was also published in other languages, in French and Hebrew. And in the introduction to that volume, where this philosopher Levinas is talking about reading the Talmud as a philosopher, he says the following. So again, this is source number 5. He says, if the Talmud is not philosophy, its tractates are an eminent source of those experiences from which philosophies derive their nourishment. So what Levinas means by this is that, yes, the Talmud is not a work of philosophy. It is a work of, if we could characterize it as one thing, it's a work of Jewish law, perhaps. Even that, scholars of the Talmud would tell you, is far more complicated. But it's certainly not philosophy. But nevertheless, it is full of material that is the kinds of materials that philosophers reflect upon to create their philosophies. And so similarly, I am going to be drawing out from Talmudic and other sources, other ancient Jewish sources, material that we can then use to think about a Jewish philosophy of civic friendship. Okay, so with that kind of methodological point in mind, my last introductory piece before the Hanukkah material is to remind all of you of perhaps the most famous Jewish tradition of civic friendship that all of you have probably heard of, which is the idea that at first might seem to have nothing to do with civic friendship, because it might seem to be, and in fact it is, its opposite. It's the concept that is famous in the Talmud and in the Jewish calendar years surrounding the mourning of the destruction of the temples and so many other crises in Jewish history, that is commemorated on the 9th of Av. And so around that season of the year, around the 9th of Av, and that is the concept of sinat chinam, the concept of a kind of civic hatred that existed in Jewish society in the time of the Second Temple period, and that caused the destruction of the Second Temple. So I bring you the source from the Babylonian Talmud in source number 6, which explicitly states why was the Second Temple destroyed? Due to the fact that there was sinat chinam. Okay, the Second Temple is famously in Jewish kind of historical and literary memory was destroyed because of a civic hatred that existed, again, amongst fellow Jews. And the question we will want to ask ourselves is, how does civic hatred lead to the destruction of the temple. And then there's another famous story. So if we could just see the whole of text number 7 right now by scrolling down. I'm not going to read this whole text. You can look at it on your own time, but this is a famous story that appears elsewhere in the Talmud that seems to be linked to this tradition that the temple was destroyed over civic hatred. And it's a particular story about a man who had a friend and an enemy who had very similar names. Okay, one was named Kamsa and one was named Bar Kamsa. Okay, and he was making a party and he invited his friend, but accidentally the invitation went to the enemy. It went to the address of the person with the very similar name. And this person came to the party and then was subsequently humiliated by the host at the party, who kicked him out. And the story goes into all sorts of details about what lengths this enemy was trying to go to avoid embarrassment. He offered to pay for the entire party. Just don't kick me out. Just don't humiliate me. And the answer is no. So he is kicked out. And then this man who was humiliated decides that he wants to take revenge against all of those who participated in his humiliation. And he goes to the Romans, to the emperor, and he says, the Jews have rebelled against you. And this leads in the story to the emperor going to kind of examine more closely what's going on with the Jews. And this leads, and through other orchestrations, this leads to the emperor feeling insulted by something that the Jews did, and then destroying the temple. Okay, so the point that I wanted to make by bringing these two sources is just to show us that we have an incredibly strong tradition of the kind of flip side of civic friendship in again, Jewish historical and literary memory, which is the idea that one of the greatest destructions in Jewish history, which was the loss of political life in the land of Israel for thousands of years, happened due to civic enmity between Jews. And it also happened due to, and when we go into details about this, we see that people were humiliating one another. And then also turning these petty humiliations into massive revenge. And so all of these details come into what we think about what civic enmity is, which is the idea of not treating someone according to the core practices of friendship. The way that Bar Kamsa was treated in the story is absolutely not according to civic friendship and the norms of it. But at the same time, the way that Bar Kamsa responded to his humiliation by bringing a broader political devastation is certainly also deeply problematic and disproportionate. And these kinds of escalations are what happen when there is civic enmity. And if we turn now to source number 8, which is the next source, we see that a 20th century Polish Jewish rabbi who named Moshe Avigdor Amiel, who subsequently emigrated to the land of Israel, he wrote sermons, and many of his sermons addressed contemporary concerns of Jewish politics and Jewish peoplehood in his lifetime. And I present to you here an excerpt from a sermon that he gave in 1934, just before the beginning of the new year, just before Rosh Hashanah. And this sermon was a sermon on Parshat Ki Tavo, one of the last parshiot, one of the last Torah portions in the annual Torah cycle. And it's a Torah portion that, according to the Talmud, must always be read before the new year, must always be read before Rosh Hashanah. And the reason the Talmud gives for that is because this Torah portion contains a lot of curses, or what's known as profound rebuke. It's in the Hebrew word for this is tochacha. This Torah portion talks basically about the demise of the people. If should they prove to not be behaving as they should be behaving, then terrible things will befall them. Okay. And again, this is in Parshat Kitavot, towards the end of the biblical book of Deuteronomy. And Moshe Avigdor Amiel, in talking about this particular Torah portion, and in particular in talking about this rebuke that takes place in this towards the end of the annual Torah cycle, he connects the rebuke that appears in Deuteronomy with the destruction of the Second Temple, which happened much later, of course. And the entire sermon is really fascinating to see how he makes this connection. For our purposes, we don't need to know why he's connecting this to the destruction of the Second Temple. What's more important is to see what he says. So I begin in the second sentence here in source number 8. The second destruction, that is the destruction of the Second Temple, came primarily from sinat chinam. In this case, he says, the sin itself, the wanton hatred, is what destroys the lifeblood of the people and turned us into weakened members. So he's explaining here the rabbinic idea that the temple was destroyed due to sinat chinam. I said a few moments ago that we don't yet understand how civic enmity destroys a temple. We saw a little bit in the a kind of historical answer that showed an example of civic enmity with the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, and then how that person then went to the emperor and brought the emperor's attention to the people and the emperor's dislike and desire to destroy the temple. So that's a kind of historical answer that appears in the Talmud. But Amiel offers us a much more political, philosophical answer. And he says that the sin itself, the hatred, is what destroys the people. Civic hatred destroys the people and weakens it. The destruction of the people, he says, is 77 times worse than the destruction of the temple. And the temple, the Hebrew word for temple is bayit, which is also the same as the word for house. So then he goes on to say, when a house is destroyed, later the homeowner or the children of the homeowner or their grandchildren may find the strength and hope to reestablish the house on its hill. But when a people is destroyed, who will establish and nourish it? So Amiel says that basically when there's civic enmity among a people itself, that itself is what leads to the political demise of the people. Because you can't have political success or sovereignty when you hate one another, when you're constantly fighting with one another, when the people itself lacks civic friendship, lacks trust, lacks the ability to work together on shared projects and on building a future. And so he explains that this destruction was, the sin and the destruction were basically the same thing. Civic friendship, civic enmity, that is, itself is already the end of a political society, or the beginning of the end. All right, so that's some background to show how central this concept is to Jewish thought more broadly. I'm sure many of you in this room have heard of sinat chinam. And now I turn us to some less familiar material relating to the Hannukah story. And there's a lot of material here, and much of it we won't be able to look at in the text themselves, but I provided this lengthy source sheets because I hope that you can look at the texts on your own time and find them interesting. So sources 9 and 10 are two historical sources from around the Second Temple period. One of them is the Book of Maccabees, which is a Jewish book written in the Second Temple period, possibly in Hebrew or otherwise in Aramaic, but it didn't survive in its original form. It only survived in its Greek translation. And this is a historical source that it provides much of our historical information about the story of Hannukah and the kind of the Jewish political context. Additionally, our other major Jewish historical source is Flavius Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian. who discusses the Hanukkah story in his books, The Jewish Wars. And what I just want to mention, and again, we're not going to look at this, unfortunately, we don't have time, in source 9, which is from the book of Maccabees, and in source 10, which is from Josephus, we see that before the Hanukkah story began, the story that is most familiar to us, which is the military battle between the Greek Empire and the small band of Jewish warriors, before that began to take place, there was an internal civil war between the Jews themselves. So let's skip source number 9, which depicts this in another way, and we'll look at it in more brevity in source number 10 with Josephus. So Josephus says, and I'll just read the beginning of this, at the time that Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, had a quarrel with the sixth Ptolemy about his right to the whole country of Syria, a great sedition fell among the men of power in Judea. So while big things are happening in the Greek and Syrian empires that relate to broader geopolitical factors far beyond Judea and the land of ancient Israel, or Second Temple Israel, that is, at the very same time that the rulers who were part of the Hanukkah story were coming to power, there was a great sedition among those in power in Judea. That is, there was a civil war, okay? And they had a contention about obtaining the government, while each of those that were of dignity could not endure to be subject to their equals. So there were a bunch of different actors here, none of whom wanted to be ruled by their fellows, and so basically they were vying for power. Okay, and then one of the high priests named Onias, again, this is a Jewish high priest, Kohen Gadol, he expelled certain other priests, and different ones fled to different political leaders. Some fled to Antiochus, others fled to Ptolemy. And this is the backstory of the Hanukkah story. So I think this very much speaks to, from much less famous sources, something similar to what we saw in the material about the destruction of the Second Temple. Yes, the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans, by a great empire, but the seed for the destruction, what made the people vulnerable to demise was the fact that they were internally warring with one another, was the fact that there was civic enmity. And similarly, we see that before the war happened between the Jews and greater political powers, there was an internal war that weakened them, and that contributed in some ways to the war that again is the more famous war. And in Josephus's account, Onias basically calls the Jews' attention, calls the attention of the political rulers to Jerusalem and to what's going on among the Jews. And this is what first led to all those laws, not that banning Jewish practice, banning circumcision, banning celebrating the Sabbath, etc., banning Torah study, things that are kind of more the persecutions that are more famously part of the beginning of the Hanukkah story. If we look in these historical sources, we see that it seems that this was brought upon them in some ways through as part of the results of civic enmity. So this idea that's familiar to us from famous Jewish sources about the destruction of the Second Temple also appears in earlier sources. Just to be clear, these are sources that were written during the Second Temple period, before the Second Temple was destroyed. So these sources come before the Talmudic sources that we read a moment ago, those famous Talmudic sources about Sinat Chinam. So we see this is an ongoing theme in Jewish history, and in the political thought of the Jews, that civic enmity leads to weakness more broadly, and the ability to be conquered more broadly, and the destruction of the society. Okay, so I want to turn now to the next set of sources. If we're able to just scroll down. Now I want us to begin, and in the remainder of our time together, we're going to focus on the miracles of Hanukkah and the holiday itself, which is not so much about the wars, but about celebrating miracles. And what I want to mention here is that basically there are famously two, and less famously perhaps three, miracles associated with Hanukkah. So the most famous miracle, perhaps, well, maybe there's a contest. I recently polled some students about this, and it was kind of 50-50. So the two contenders for the most famous miracles of Hanukkah are either the military victory, again, when a very small and not very powerful political society, and in particular, one that was kind of already at civil war amongst itself, so was already not particularly strong, when that society beat back a conquering empire. So that is the military victory of a very small group against a more powerful group. So that was considered the kind of secular political again, or military miracle of Hanukkah. And I'll just mention that in the book of Maccabees, this is the only miracle of Hanukkah that is mentioned. And it's not mentioned as a miracle. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then, of course, but although other Jewish sources do talk about it as a miracle, as a miraculous victory, an improbable victory that could only have happened with the help of God. But the other really famous miracle is, of course, the miracle of the oil that lasted for 8 days when there was really only enough for one day. And here I want to turn your attention to, very briefly, to the book of Maccabees. And this is source number 11 that's on the screen right now, which says, "There occurred that day a great salvation in Israel. And Judas and his brothers said," Judas, that is Judah the Maccabee, Judas Maccabeus, as he is known in the book of Maccabees. And Judas and his brothers said, "Behold, our enemies have been crushed." So there is a concept that this was a day of salvation. So there is a kind of concept that it's a miracle in some way. It's certainly a salvation. But again, we don't get a deep discussion of miracle here. And then once they win the war, a few things happen. First, they say immediately, "Let us go up and purify the temple and rededicate it." And I'm sorry if you lost me for a moment. I saw that I got a notification about the microphone again. So I'll just repeat the last thing I said, which was that as soon as they win the war, they go to purify the temple and rededicate it. And the scene that they find when they reach the Temple Mount is a scene of great destruction. So much has been desecrated, burned down. Everything has been destroyed essentially. And so they work to purify the temple. They have to rebuild certain temple vessels and objects, and they have to find and locate other objects. But there's no mention here of an absence of pure oil. There's no mention here of a scarcity of oil. And it just says that once they kind of purified the temple, they lit the lights upon the candelabrum. That's the second underlined part on the sources here. And then it says that in paragraph number 2 here, we get mention of the 25th day of Kislev, which is the first day of Hanukkah in the 148th year. They basically sanctified the temple once again, and then they just had a celebration for 8 days. No mention really of the light of the menorah being lit for 8 days. It's just that they had a dedication ceremony for 8 days, which is similar to other dedication ceremonies that we see biblically of the dedication of the tabernacle and the temple. And then furthermore, they establish this as a holiday in perpetuity. Okay, So they establish an 8-day holiday in perpetuity that should be holidays of mirth and days of mirth and joy for time to come. And we might assume from the creation of this holiday that the war was completely over. The war was won and it was over. But this is only something that takes place in the middle of the book of Maccabees. This is chapter 4, these quotations that I'm bringing you about Hanukkah. And the book continues with more attacks and more wars. This wasn't really a decisive victory that led to this celebration. Rather, it was like a pause. It was like a moment to celebrate and be joyous about a small victory that happened in the midst of something that gave hope and strength to continue, but it was not at all a decisive and final victory. So that's one thing I want to point out. And let's turn now to the next source. And I'll just mention briefly something about these two sources. The next source is Josephus, his account of the story of Hanukkah, and also a further account later on in the book of in the first book of Maccabees. And what I want to mention from these two sources before I quickly move on to the last two texts I want us to look at, just is that these two sources mention a treatise of friendship that Judah Maccabee pursued with Rome during this time. And not a treatise, I mean a treaty of friendship that Judah Maccabee pursued with Rome during this time. And this is something that is historically attested to, not just in Jewish sources, but also in non-Jewish sources, also in Roman sources. There really was a treaty of friendship between Rome and the Jews at this time period, and it was pursued in the context of this political fight with the Greeks. And so I just want to mention this briefly because I want us to see that while there is enmity with one powerful empire, there is also a pursuit of friendship with a different would-be enemy, with a different powerful empire. And if you read the descriptions of why this friendship was pursued, Rome, again, who later would be described so terribly in later Jewish sources, Rome, the destroyers of the Second Temple, in these sources, Rome is described very positively, especially in First Maccabees, where Rome is described, in particular, Rome in the era of the Roman Republic, is described as a society that basically exemplifies civic friendship. And this is exactly why Judah Maccabee wanted to pursue a treaty of friendship with Rome at this time, because he felt that they could be trusted, and he felt that they had good values that he wanted to be in political relationship with. Now, of course, there's all sorts of political benefits to have a positive relationship with a great empire. And nevertheless, this is presented as a decision based on values, and these values have to do with friendship, civic friendship, and the way in which Rome in the era of the Republic was viewed as exemplifying that. All right, and now I want to turn briefly to the miracle of oil. And with this, I will conclude what I want to say about friendship and civic friendship and the story of Hanukkah. So the source that's on the screen right now is from the Babylonian Talmud, which basically says, what is Hanukkah? This is the place where the Talmud says what Hanukkah is. And when the Talmud talks about Hanukkah, it barely mentions the military victory, and it mentions instead this miracle of the oil that we all know about, that I mentioned was not mentioned at all in the historical sources. And that's the key thing that I want us to see in this text, and I don't want to take up time looking at it together, because we're almost out of time for my presentation, and we want to have a robust question and answer period as well. And so I just want us to see that in the Talmud, the story of Hanukkah is primarily a story not about a military victory, that existed and it's in the backdrop, but it is a story about a miracle of oil, a religious miracle, a miracle where there was only one canister of pure oil in a temple that had been defiled by political enemies. And there was only enough for one day. And nevertheless, someone in an act of profound hope decided to light that menorah, even though there was only enough for one day. And it was going to take 8 more days until new pure oil could be procured, just through the purifying process and the way in which the supply chain had been profoundly disrupted by the crisis of war. And so they lit the menorah knowing that they couldn't keep it lit. And then miraculously, the menorah remains lit for 8 more days until more pure oil can be procured. And it's on the basis of this miracle, says the Talmud, that the holiday was established. But I want us to turn to one last source to draw out what I hope will be really profound lessons about friendship and wartime and the Hanukkah story. Now, this last source that I'm turning us to is not about Hanukkah at all. In fact, it's from the Tanakh, it's from the Hebrew Bible. It predates the Hanukkah story. It's before the Hasmoneans existed. And it's before the period of it's long before the period of the Second Temple is part of anyone's even imagination. Okay, so this is a story from the second book of Kings, and it's even before the first temple was built, and it's a story that has to do with, which is one among many stories that are told about the famous prophet Elijah, his famous but slightly less famous disciple Elisha. And it's a story of a woman who comes to the prophet Elisha, describing her own dire, horrific circumstances. She says that her husband has just died and she's in such profound poverty that a creditor is coming to seize her 2 children as slaves. She has nothing, and she has a tremendous amount of debt, and she's in mourning, and she's in crisis, and she's in the profoundest of poverty that would lead again to the enslavement of her children. And then Elisha says to her that here's what he can do for her. He asks her, this is in verse 2 now on the screen. Elisha said to her, "What can I do for you? Tell me, what have you in the house?" And she replied that she has nothing in the house except 1 single jug of oil. And Elisha the prophet says to her, "Go and borrow vessels outside from all of your neighbors, empty vessels, as many as you can. Then go in and shut the door behind you and your children and pour oil from the 1 jug of oil that she has into all those vessels, removing each one as it is filled." So she went away and shut the door behind her and her children, and they, meaning the neighbors, kept bringing vessels to her, and she kept pouring. And when the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he answered her, "There are no more vessels." So the neighbors have brought all of their empty vessels, and the oil from the 1 jug of oil keeps pouring and filling each of these empty vessels. And finally, when there's no vessel left to hold oil, the oil stops. So then the woman came out and told the agent of God, that is the prophet Elisha, that the oil has stopped. And he said to her, "Okay, go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your children can live on the rest." So the reason I bring this story is I bring it as a biblical intertext for the Hanukkah story. This is a miracle of oil. This is a miracle in which there is only 1 jug of oil, similar to the 1 canister of oil from the famous Hanukkah miracle. And there's a profound crisis in the surrounding situation. There's profound and deep poverty, the likes of which few of us in this room have ever encountered, the kind of poverty that would lead to the enslavement of someone's children. Okay. And In the Hanukkah story, there's one jug of oil and there's a different destruction that's all around. It's not the private poverty of a family or a community, but it's rather the devastation and destruction of a war. There's just slaughter, mass slaughter, and there's destruction of holy sites and of homes and whatever there is that kind of comes with war. And in both cases, we have an act of profound hope. In the Hanukkah story, to light the menorah, even though you don't think it can last. And in this story, to listen to the prophet gather empty vessels from neighbors, which seems like an absurd thing to do, and to pour into those vessels, which again seems like an absurd thing to do. And in both cases, the act of hope turns out to bear fruit. It turns out that even when there's a tremendous scarcity of resources, when there is hope and friendship, that scarcity of resources can turn into much more than one thought at first. So the friendship in the story here in the Book of Kings is a friendship of neighbors helping one another. They're all poor. Perhaps each of them only had this one jug in their home, this one empty vessel, and still all of these neighbors come and bring everything and bring what they have to their friend, and they also don't know the reason, and they can't possibly imagine what she could be doing with these vessels. And in the Hanukkah story, the friendship is the friendship of celebrating together, of the friendship that Maimonides talked about, that comes from creating holidays and from celebrating holidays together. And in both cases, we see that there's a tremendous amount of hope for the future. And I'm going to, if we could perhaps stop the screen share. I want to close my remarks and open up the discussion by just kind of summarizing what I have presented today in the materials that I've brought here. So we've talked about the concept of civic friendship as a concept from political philosophy that talks about the ways in which we need to have a kind of friendship and build trust and respect and treating others the way, certain kind of core practices of how we treat our friends. We need to do that with our fellow citizens, even the ones we don't know, even the ones we don't like that much. And that without that, we can't have a functioning society. And that in Jewish thought, this is a profound truth that and a cautionary tale that we see from the destruction of the Second Temple as being described as coming from civic enmity, from the absence of civic friendship. And we also see in the Hanukkah story that in the historical sources, there was a civil war that preceded the enemy's attack. And again, that's true as well in the description of the Second Temple's destruction. And finally, though, there's also a tremendous amount of hope that we see when we look at the creation of the Hanukkah holiday and especially the miracle of oil as an attempt to create holiday and celebration and joy against the backdrop of war and devastation, and to rebuild community and friendship through a holiday. And we also see through the biblical text that is the only other Jewish source that talks about a miracle in which oil replenishes itself from a scarce resource to something that meets the full need that is needed in that moment. We see that as also relating to devastation, the devastation of poverty, and to the hope that comes from finding friendship and relationship and drawing on the help of your neighbors, and ultimately the ways in which scarce resources taken together with friendship and hope can help turn scarcity into something that is less scarce than it seems to be at first, and can help make resources last longer. And of course, there's a lot of connections we could make to current events, both in the United States and Israel. And I'm happy to think about any of those things together with you, or any other questions that the material brings up for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Billet. Someone just wrote, Dr. Billet could make a fabulous sermon out of all of this, which she certainly could. You're looking for a new career when this one is done. So there are definitely questions. There's something that you said, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes back that really that really stuck with me. Of course, I can't remember exactly the way you phrased it, but it was something like when you know, when the situation is one of civic enmity, then even before you get to the war or whatever else ensues, kind of all is lost. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yes, that's from the sermon of Moshe Avigdor Amiel, the 20th century Polish, and then transplanted to pre-state Israel, wrote that when the Talmud says that the Second Temple was destroyed due to civic enmity, due to sinat chinam, without explaining how that worked, he explains that itself was the destruction, because civic enmity itself is the beginning of the demise of the people. There is no ability to work together. There is no ability to have a society, to have a future, when you have such profound civic enmity.
Beautiful, beautiful. So I hesitate to just, rush right to thrusting us into current events, but when you shared that source and you summarized it so powerfully the way you just did again, I couldn't help thinking about how a few months ago, including when we planned this series, Israeli society was falling apart on a totally different front. And in a way that we'd never seen, certainly you and I in our lifetimes. And really society like grinding to a halt because people because there were such clashing visions of where things should go, and the way in which that has, I think we can stipulate, temporarily evaporated since the war has been stunning to me. So I just couldn't help thinking about that in light of that source. Like, it was hard to see, like, how could Israeli society come together in a crisis, a few months ago when everything was the way it was, and Israeli society has very much come together in a crisis. I don't know. I wonder if you thought about that or.
Yeah. So, one thing that I thought about which is a little bit of a kind of taking a step back from the way Israeli society came together, which I agree, that's something that people are really marveling about. And I'll say more about that in a moment, though I'm by no means an expert on anything contemporary or Israeli society. But taking a step back, a lot of people talked about how the vulnerability that Israel experienced on October 7th was directly related to the polarization that Israel experienced in the year before, in the sense that, I'm sure many of you have read about these things. Military leaders warned the government that the political polarization was itself a security threat. And so I can think of kind of no better contemporary expression to the idea that civic enmity within weakens you and makes you vulnerable to attack. That was something that people warned about, and that in fact did happen. But what you're pointing out is this other piece, that then there was a profound vulnerability that came through civic enmity. But then how was this society able to bounce back? And I guess without getting too political, I think one thing that we might see is that this society, the enmity that we were seeing over the past year, clearly does not run as deep as it looked. And it was rather something that was the result of deeply problematic leadership, pushing people apart in all sorts of ways. But the society itself had not fully frayed and come apart. And so I guess the hope would be that, unlike the Second Temple period destruction that is talked about both in the rabbinic sources and again by this 20th century Rabbi Moshe Avigdor Amiel, as a kind of decisive and final destruction. And Amiel talks about how it lasted for 2,000 years. It was quite decisive. The hope would be that in this case, there's been a warning and a profound price has been paid, the depths of which can't be measured. And also that it's unlike that kind of ancient example, not a society that has fully frayed or that has fully lost its ability to come together.
Thank you. There were some interesting comments about resources. You know, I never heard anyone bring in the story of Elisha and this other miracle of the oil in the context of Hanukkah. So I love that. I love just you know, putting that comparison in front of us, and I love where you went with it in terms of the kinds of you know, the parallels you drew and the possibilities that are opened in each situation. So in light of that, there were a couple of comments about resources, scarcity of resources. Excuse me. One person wrote, I'll just read what she said, was the symbolism of the neighbors' vessels, that her neighbors should have been helping her from the beginning. The neighbors couldn't have all been poor because she had a debt to pay and people were going to buy this oil so she could retire the debt. So they obviously had money to buy the oil, meaning it would seem that, you know, if we sort of guess that she may have asked them for a full vessel of oil beforehand and they said no, it's like they come, sure, they're happy to come around when she asks them for an empty pot of nothing.
So I think about this a little bit differently. Now, of course, there are so many literary possibilities, and I'm also not a Bible scholar. So I am kind of reading this material in the kind of Levinasian way that I put out at the beginning, as reading this material as a kind of nourishment, as the sources from which philosophical or political thinking derives its nourishment. But the way that I'm reading this story, and again, recognizing that there are multiple interpretations, is I'm assuming that the neighbors are also profoundly poor. Maybe not exactly in the same dire straits as her, because she has also just been widowed. But that all that they have to share with her is their empty vessels, and they don't have oil. Again, maybe they also have one full jug in their homes, but they don't have children who are about to be sold into slavery, right? So they're in dire straits, but perhaps slightly less dire straits than her. And what we see here is that, so again, this is how I'm reading it, that despite the fact that everyone is so poorly off, instead of just focusing in on their own problems and their own challenges and their own difficulties, they are trying to do what they can for one another. And so they are coming together to give what they have, in this case, which is an empty vessel. And this might seem like a meaningless gesture, right? To give the little that you have. But I think the story shows that this is a kind of source of hope for the kinds of friendships that we can have and what the kinds of things we can do for one another in times of crisis. Sometimes when there's a collective crisis, everyone feels like they have nothing left to give. All I have is empty vessels in my home or myself. I myself am just an empty vessel. But it turns out that there's someone who's worse off than you, however badly off you are. And maybe the empty vessel that you have, which feels like nothing, is actually something. And in this case, it really was something. And so I kind of want to read it here as a lesson for how there can be friendship, even in times of crisis, and even in times when people kind of focus inward on their own problems and don't really want to think about or don't feel that they have the capacity for someone else's deeper problems. There still is something that you can do. So again, that's how I'm reading it here. But of course, there's the possibility that these friends were themselves not such great actors. I was assuming that the oil is not being sold to the friends, but is being sold at some kind of market, maybe to traders. There's all sorts of other ways we could think about it, but certainly that reading is possible.
you reminded me of right, there's data showing that people who are poor give charity at a higher rate compared to their means, and also I think many studies showing that even and maybe especially folks who are very, very busy, the more one volunteers, the more fulfilled and sort of enriched one feels in one's life. So right, we tend to, maybe what I'm getting from what you were just saying is we tend to think of our resources as more limited than they necessarily are. Of course, the other place to go with scarcity of resources, which maybe I'll spare you from, is right, the scarcity of resources happening in the Middle East, both in terms of I couldn't help thinking about you were talking about the oil and the small amounts of oil. I couldn't help thinking about fuel shortages among Gazan citizens and all that. And then, of course, the larger issue of the scarcity of resource of land, that there's a bit of land that everyone wants the same one. We can't pour it into we can't just pour out, even if we had the miraculous ability to pour out another one, it somehow wouldn't solve our problems. But I'm not going to put you on that spot unless you want to say something.
No, I appreciate the comparisons, and I don't feel competent to speak certainly about the kind of scarcity of oil, fuel, etc., like kind of these kinds of comparisons. But what I will say more broadly is that just about this entrenched conflict is that the conflict is worse than it seems like it has to be in some world in which there could be trust and some form of friendship between these two societies or groups of people. And of course, there's so much debate and differing narratives about why and how it came to be, where things are right now. And I don't want to get into that. I just like the rest of you, I myself am struggling to come to terms with all those things and to read everything that I can to understand. So I wouldn't present myself as an expert on that. But what I would say is that I do think that some kind of goal, however long it could possibly take, given that nobody's going away from this shared space, would be to find the ideal, I think, for everybody would be a coexistence in which there could be mutual trust, whatever that looked like. I'm not talking about a particular political arrangement or anything else. And so the things that I would be interested in taking from this material towards that would be, what possible ways could beginnings of civic friendship be achieved? Now, I mentioned at the beginning that civic friendship is hard work. And I would say that it feels hard enough to get Democrats and Republicans in the United States of America to not hate each other. And mostly they don't have the kinds of trauma and history that we see in the conflict in Israel and Gaza and the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so if it's that hard here, then it's infinitely harder over there. And nevertheless, what the hope that I would look for is, what is the can of oil that I could start lighting that feels like totally an absurd act that couldn't possibly do anything that maybe could. And I don't know what that thing is. So again, I share, because I think the things that I'm saying are things that we all share, hopes that we all share for a future of coexistence. And the ability to have trust, which seems like a key obstacle to coexistence right now, is how much neither side feels like they can trust the other to keep them safe. And so building trust feels like a central thing here, and trust as a central component of friendship. But I don't have answers to what the can of oil is or what the empty jug is, but just the hope to continue to pursue that work some way, somehow.
That's beautiful. it's interesting that there are plenty of comments about our domestic situation also. And sometimes I almost think about it the opposite way, right? Because we're such a higher percentage of, for each of us, such a higher percentage of our fellow Americans, for those who are American, is anonymous to us. It's actually is unknown. There's like, who knows how many degrees of separation, which is different in Israel. There was a song that was going around that got some people loved it, some people hated it. The song I'm talking about, it was this video of this sort of two people on opposite sides of the intra-Israeli conflict some months back. Something.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So it was two Israelis trying to get each other to understand their perspective, and it was like something that can come out of a society where it's more a dysfunctional family than like a seriously dysfunctional society. Like this, we're so far from a dysfunctional family, I think, here in the United States. So maybe there's, I don't know, who knows? Maybe the oil is more accessible there than maybe they'll end up being a model for us.
Well, I don't want to give up hope for here either, and I think that I would just mention briefly that I did teach a course this semester on friendship at JTS, and one of the topics that we did was civic friendship, of course. And we spent a couple of weeks reading Aristotle and others in much more depth than the kind of one-liners that I presented to you today. But the assignment that I gave my students relating to that topic was what we called a civic friendship practicum, where they had to go out into the world. They live in New York City, and to actively pursue encounters with people who are different from them in some way, shape, or form, and including all different kinds of differences. But one that I also wanted was political difference, because we read also about political difference. There are obviously so many differences, and to reflect on what came for them from these experiences, to kind of connect it to course readings, but it was also a kind of journal, a kind of like more intellectual or high level journal. But and the idea is that trying to just talk to strangers, and that's the title of Danielle Allen's book that I cited from at the beginning on civic friendship. She's a Black political philosopher thinking about how there could be civic friendship and trust in America, kind of across racial divides, a book that was written in 2004. And one of the ways to build trust is just talking to each other. And she talks about how we teach our kids, don't talk to strangers, but actually her advice in the book is do talk to strangers, that we need to learn to talk to our fellow citizens. And part of that is seeing and just talking to people is a way of seeing them as human beings. So I think I have hope for America too, but I think people have to be willing to put in the work.
Thank you. I love that you assigned that to your students. And I was just remembering that in my a rabbinic WhatsApp group that I'm in, someone posted a few days ago about a Jewish Palestinian solidarity circle, like a small group of people, sort of a model they're trying to get out there. I need to look more at it, which you're giving me a good nudge to do. But right, we need to look for where we can do our part on those, on Broadway or online or wherever our corner is. I know we don't have that much time left. There were some more kind of academic questions that I wanted to give a voice to before we wrap up. Okay, so one person asked, given that the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus was a direct precursor to the abdication of Jewish sovereignty to the Roman Empire and the ultimate destruction of the temple, why would we keep celebrating this debacle?
So there's you would have to bring a Second Temple era scholar to talk about that. Meaning there's a lot of years intervening between the destruction of the Second Temple and sorry, I'm just making, okay, I didn't lose my video. There's a lot of years intervening between the destruction of the Second Temple by Rome and this treaty of friendship. And so how direct these events are with one another, I'm sure historians would question. Also, while the treaty of friendship did exist, meaning because we have evidence not just in Jewish sources, but also in Roman sources and also in Christian sources, it's unclear what exactly its implications were and what exactly it meant. And it doesn't seem to be any kind of abdication of sovereignty. It seems to be less robust than a full-blown treaty. It seems like it was an expression of some kind of solidarity and friendship, but it wasn't even something that relied that required like coming to aid in the time of in a time of crisis. So again, these are questions for the historians of the period. My period that I work on, just for reference, while I study modern Jewish thought more broadly, the period that I'm most kind of historically familiar with is 19th and 20th century Jewish thought, and in European context especially. So I would bring on a Second Temple scholar to speak more to that question.
Okay, and one more. I'll just paraphrase, but the person was pointing out that and I think we can do this without a Second Temple period scholar. The holiday or the military victory, let's say, happened long before we start hearing about a miracle of oil, right? And it seems that kind of layering on by the rabbis was a way of, bringing God into the holiday, sort of adding some other kinds of valences to the holiday that weren't just about a military victory of the small, the few against the many. So I guess the person was raising that question, in the context of that's sort of where we're going for meaning and what you've presented, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that if you read the book of Maccabees, 1 Maccabees, First Maccabees, it's a deeply religious book, meaning there's the whole impetus for what the Maccabees are doing, and the little army that they create is a response to religious persecution and defilement of the temple, meaning it is a response to the fact that they were being disallowed from practicing their religion. So God is there, but God is not there as a miracle worker in miracles that kind of transcend the laws of nature. So I guess I would just clarify that. And so yes, the rabbis and the miracle of oil brings God in a more miraculous way, or in a more obviously miraculous way, I should say. But it is important to see that even in First Maccabees, which is a more quote unquote secular text, it is still very much deeply a deeply pious text. And the Maccabees themselves, or the Hasmoneans, are deeply pious people who are kind of crusaders for faith as well as political actors, at least according to the descriptions in First Maccabees. And I think that the miracle of oil in Kings, presumably God is in the background there, but of course God is not mentioned at all. You have a kind of prophet who's a kind of miracle worker, and it's not even clear. And I guess I was reading it in a more secular way anyway, that there's this kind of act of hope makes scarce resources last more than we think they could. So I wouldn't say that that's the direction that I was taking it in, but I do think that the kind of the role God plays and what kinds of miracles feel like bigger than others is itself a kind of interesting question to think more about.
Great, that's very helpful what you just said. Right, I'm so used to thinking of the miracle of the oil as the God part, but you drew out something else, which is about generosity, about hope. So there's another sermon for you. just the miracle of the oil, or miracles of oil, can be read in a lot of different ways. I so appreciate, I'm sorry that I'm in such a compromised state today, but I so appreciate, and I'm sure everyone here does, just this tremendous collection of sources that you've brought for us, and how you've built a whole framework for us about this, this bedrock of civic friendship that we need in order to have a functioning society, and that we're lost without it. And also, that framework is there in secular and Jewish texts as well. But also that we need hope, that we need generosity of spirit, that we need an in it together kind of sense in order for it to all happen. So and I so appreciate your charge to look for, where's the oil around us that we can pour, look for the miracles. And, we talk about miracles when we light Hanukkah candles, as we are this week, but we also, it's in our daily prayers as well, to think about nisim and niflaot, the same words, these wondrous miracles that we focus on times like Hanukkah. Our daily prayers challenge us to find those around us every single day. So I'm going to use your session, this beautiful session, as a charge to keep doing that. And as a ray of hope, I hope our participants will do the same. We're so grateful for your wisdom and teaching today. And we wish everyone a happy rest of Hanukkah and a good winter rest where you can find it. We pray for peace for all those who need it, which is everyone, but for the hostages, for all those suffering in the Middle East and everywhere. And we look forward to resuming our learning with you on January 22nd. And thank you so much again, Dr. Billet, for teaching us today.
Thank you. Thank you all.